Hi, I'm Catherine Kung from Indian Spring School.
I am Krystal Lee from Indian Spring School.
And I'm Andrew Glassford from Indian Spring School.
To begin with, we will briefly introduce our problem backgrounds and its significance. In 2010, the Deepwater Horizon accident spilled huge amounts of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. Based on the research, these unrefined oil can be extremely toxic and carcinogenic, for example, like PAHs. The Gulf currents then carry large amounts of oil onto the beaches. Besides, oil cleanup is extremely difficult because of the issues like oil clumping into small sand oil agglomerate and getting buried deep into beaches.
Petroleum hydrocarbons from the oil that spill into the sand is a form of pollution that poses a hazard to both the environment and to humans. It adversely affects both land and marine ecosystems and causes organic pollution of the ocean. SOAs that were 2,500 times larger than the ones that were studied were found after the Deepwater Horizon spill. This highlights the importance of being able to estimate the long-lasting impacts of these oil spills.
Here is a list of simplified assumptions for our model. Firstly, since our objective is to build a model that only accounts for the evolving mass, we assume the overall volume of the sand oil agglomerate will not change over time. Secondly, we assume the oxygen concentration remains constant over time for any given sand oil agglomerate. Thirdly, we consider microbes as the only factor that would impact the degradation of sand oil agglomerate. Fourthly, we consider microbial decomposition of oil follows standard chemical kinetics laws. And finally, we assume depth and porosity are directly proportional to oxygen concentration. Here is a list of variables and initial values we assign to our models. For the variables, we have capital M, which represents the mass of the sand oil agglomerate, capital D, the depth at which the sand oil agglomerate is buried, capital P, the porosity of the sand oil agglomerate, capital T, the time taken for the sand oil agglomerate to decompose, and capital C, which is the arbitrary constant. And for the initial values, we have the initial mass of the sand oil agglomerate equals to 83.3 grams. Next, we have 5 successive depth at which the sand oil agglomerate is buried, ranges from 10 centimeters to 50 centimeters. And we assume the porosity rates of the sand oil agglomerate will always equals to 49%. Finally, for the arbitrary constant, we assume it to be 0.00004.
For our model, we decided to adopt a first-order kinetics rate law framework. We started by looking at the chemical equation. Oil plus O2 through a catalyst of microbes goes to CO2 plus H2O plus some inorganic compounds. Now, by the basic kinetics framework, we get that the rate is equal to some arbitrary constant K times the concentration of each of the reactants, each to the power of their coefficient in the original equation. Now, by one of our assumptions, the concentration of oil will remain constant, and the concentration of oil is also directly proportional to the depth of the buried SOA and the porosity of the surrounding sand, times some proportionality constant, C. This yields rate equals KCdP times the concentration of oil, and since K and C are both arbitrary constants, neither of which we know currently, they can be combined to yield rate equals KdP times the concentration of oil. The concentration of oil decreases as the chemical reaction moves along. So, the rate of change of the concentration of oil with respect to time is equal to the negative of the reaction rate, or d concentration of oil dt equals negative KdP times the concentration of oil. Rearranging, we get d concentration of oil over concentration of oil equals negative KdP times dt. Integrate both sides, and we get the natural log of the concentration of oil is equal to negative KdPt plus some arbitrary constant C. Exponentiating both sides results in the concentration of oil equals some other arbitrary constant A times E raised to the negative KdPt. Adding in our initial values of oil equals some concentration of oil naught at time equals 0 yields oil naught equals AE to the negative KdP times 0, or AE to the 0, or simply A. This leaves us with the concentration of oil equals the concentration of oil naught E to the negative KdPt. Now, we also know that the concentration of oil is equal to mass over volume, and we have assumed that the volume will remain constant. This yields the equation mass over volume equals mass naught over volume times e to the negative kdpt. Multiplying through by volume results in a final model of mass equals mass naught e to the negative kdpt. Here we have a graph of a few select versions of our model. For each of these lines, we assumed that the porosity would remain at a constant 49% and then vary the depth, starting with the minimum depth of 10 centimeters and going to the maximum depth of 50 centimeters. We started with red and went through the color rainbow to purple, from 10 centimeters to 50 centimeters. The solid black line is the model that was developed by the researchers. Notice that our line of green, which is a depth of 30 centimeters, lines up quite nicely with the researchers' model. An analysis of our model yielded the following results. The average half-life of the SOAs was about 1,615 days, or roughly 4.5 years. The average time that it took for an SOA to decrease to 10% of its original mass was about 5,365 days, or roughly 15 years. Now, according to our model, removing a top layer of sand, a suggestion to help expedite the process of microbial decay, would actually result in slowing down the decay. So, by our model, removing the top layer of sand would actually be a bad idea.
Looking at the model given in paper 1, and based on the R-squared value, the regression model accounts for 26% of the variance, which poorly fits with the actual data. And when we look at the interval and the dot points, the actual data trends upwards during the first year, suggesting growth rather than decay. And by evaluating both models, we can tell that our model matches the given regression line with an average that coincides with the curve shown in Figure 2a.
The main strength of our model is that it's derived from a chemical rate law and not just a random exponential function. We were able to include the various depths and take into account the concentration of oil, the concentration of oxygen, and the porosity of the sand in which the SOAs were buried. These are all testable parameters that can adapt to different experiments. The main weakness of our model is that it's based on a singular set of experimental data, so it's heavily biased. It's also based on a generalized chemical equation which doesn't explicitly take into account the microbial mechanism. What are some future directions for our model? We'd analyze other studies related to SOAs in order to improve our model. This would allow us to not be solely reliant on one study, and our model wouldn't be so heavily biased to this one set of data. We'd conduct additional research to better understand and incorporate factors to the degradation and include the slightly quadratic relationship that we found between depth and oxygen concentration. We'd like to explore more complicated chemical rate laws and possibly find a mathematical relationship in order to explain the microbial mechanism. One thing that would be crucial to the application of this model would be to determine if our model can be generalized, and particularly generalized to different compositions of the SOAs. The study that we referenced only included one type of SOAs where all of the compositions were the same. We would need to see how the change in composition and concentrations of oil and oxygen of the SOAs affect our model, in addition to the type of oil and where these SOAs are located. A change in location, such as at a different beach, would influence the type of microbes involved in the degradation and the concentration of oxygen, which could change our model since it is dependent on the oxygen concentrations. This would allow us to determine if our model is robust and can compare against a different dataset. A generalized model is important because it would allow for the application to other locations and instances of oil spills that are similar to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill.
To conclude, we concur with the researchers. Exponential decay is the best model. Our relationship between oxygen concentration and depth was most likely inverted, but the data gathered had some very counterintuitive anomalies, and we believe the experiment should be run again. We found that, no matter what, microbial decay of SOAs may very reasonably take a lifetime or longer to sufficiently get rid of them. Another means of detoxifying beaches should therefore be investigated. It turns out that we can't just rely on nature to clean up our mess.